Good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right. Kent Hill School is honored and privileged to have Amy Bass visit our community today. She is an Emmy-winning writer, born in New England. She attended Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, Lewiston being the city that serves as the significant backdrop, the setting to her book, One Goal, A Coach, a Team, and the Game That Brought a Divided Town Together. One Goal is her fourth book. She received her PhD with distinction from Stony Brook University and has built a substantial and impressive writing career as a writer, scholar, and professor in sports, politics, and culture. Currently, Bass is the chair of the Division of Social Science and professor of sports studies at Manhattanville College. Her writing has appeared in a plethora of publications, including Salon, Slate, CNN Opinion, and her work for NBC's Olympics coverage earned her an Emmy in 2012 for Outstanding Live Event Turnaround. Her book, One Goal, it resonates with me for a lot of reasons. I grew up playing soccer and hockey in northern New Hampshire, and my initial perceptions of Lewiston were largely informed by my dad, who in the mid-1990s would bring deliveries from our family hardware store, and me, I was 10 years old, I'd hop along for the ride, and we would go to clients in Lewiston. And many of these clients, my father would speak this unbelievably garbled French, hard on these R consonants, riddled with very colorful French curse words. But later, as I got older, my connection with Lewiston was about hockey. I remember many, many youth hockey games at the Coliseum, which is Lewiston's deeply historic hockey rink and multi-purpose facility, where we'd play against Lewiston's travel teams in these fiercely contested games. It was my father, in fact, who told me about the moniker Dirty Lou, as it's used and he used it as a precursor of what I should expect from these teams. And much like what Bass notes in her book, and much like some of our students here, particularly our local students might know, this label Dirty Lou has sort of become really synonymous in a way with which Lewiston was to be understood. This taxonomy still has echoes today. When my students encountered this term in the book, there were some snickers and there were some head nods and there was some looks of confusion, but in many ways it was something that folks knew about Lewiston, or in some cases just repeated because that's what other people did. That term, at worst, was this sort of hateful pejorative and at best perhaps this tired joke. And yet there was and is something so captivating about Lewiston's landscape, a necessary setting and as important as a novel's protagonist. And within this, I remember Lewiston High School's boys soccer team's historic run, this team that Bass chronicles in the book and how it played out. I was coaching boys varsity soccer here at Kent Hill at the time, and I corresponded on a number of occasions with Coach McGraw, Lewiston's head coach, about possible recruits, because this Lewiston team was as talented as Bass writes. It was ranked at number 17 out of 25 in the nation for soccer teams. They had an undefeated record, and at the end of the regular season, they had outscored their opponents by a margin of 100-7. My students watched the video of Malid Abdo's infamous flip throw, the one that helped seal a win against Scarborough in the championship, and we were just in awe. But as Bass notes in the book, the victory meant so much more. One of my favorite moments in the book occurs near the end when Bass comments on what then Lewiston High School principal Sean Shabbat, who has an absolutely wonderful last name, by the way, experiences just before the state championship game, standing in a packed Fitzpatrick Stadium. Quote, "All he saw was blue, black faces, white faces, young, old. Everyone was in blue. This wasn't a turning point for the community," he thought. This was a pinnacle, a very public demonstration of what Lewiston was becoming, had become, would become. Otherwise, these people wouldn't be here together to watch this team, end quote. This book has allowed me to reflect on my relationship and understanding of the city of Lewiston, but perhaps more importantly, it reminded me why any lesson can be learned through sports. And when Warsami Ali, a Lewiston High School soccer player, claims in the postscript, quote, "Soccer is life," the phrase helps cement the book's major message, community and the work it takes to build one. So please join me in welcoming Amy Bass. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Adam, and thank you to everyone who has been so welcoming and who worked to get me here. And a special shout out to Alex, my tour guide this morning. It's a beautiful school, and I'm really delighted to be here for a few days. So this book that I'm here to talk to you about today, One Goal, it's my fourth book. But in so many ways, in almost every way, it was a first for me, because it showcases a much different kind of writing, a different kind of storytelling than anything I had done in the past. This book started as an article for CNN. It was about 900 words, and within 48 hours of those words going live, an editor reached out and asked me if I had thought about writing a book about this soccer team. And I wrote back, I still have the email, I've thought of almost nothing else for the last 2 days. But to write One Goal, I had to make myself a student, just like you are sitting here today. So before diving into the research for this book in my usual whirlwind fashion, I really like research. I like going down those rabbit holes that take you to interesting places that you sort of hadn't planned for. Before I did any of that, I bought a book about writing. And I started reading it. And I remember the night I was sitting in my living room reading this book about writing, and my husband came in and he said, this is your fourth book. Don't you know how to do this by now? But this book was different. I wanted to tear it all down and figure out what skill sets I had and what skill sets I didn't have in terms of storytelling and put it back together. Because writing is really important to me. It lives in my head, but it lives in my heart. Because to me, to understand the craft of writing is to understand power. And I tell my own students this all the time, that developing a voice in relationship with the written word is a chance, right? It's a chance to make their arguments known, to make their feelings known, to make their stances known. And with One Goal, I wanted to use that chance that I was being given to the best of my abilities. So One Goal is a book, like most books, that comes out of a very particular time and a very particular place. It's a story that I wanted to tell to as big of an audience as possible, because I thought that its message could be very powerful, that it could be needed, and that it was missing. And when I started researching it, when I started writing it, it felt relevant. It felt really important to me to tell this refugee story. And it's almost bittersweet in a lot of ways to see how much more relevant a story about immigrants and about refugees and about America has come in terms of the time and space that we're in now. So this is a photo of November 7th, 2015, when some 4,500 people sat in the bleachers of Portland, Maine's Fitzpatrick Stadium. And most of that crowd, as you can see from the sea of blue that you're looking at, were there to watch the undefeated, nationally ranked Lewiston Blue Devils soccer team face the Scarborough Red Storm for the boys' Class A championship title. Now on paper, the two teams were pretty well matched. They both had strong defenses, they had a lot of shutout wins, they both had undefeated seasons, although Scarborough did have one tie. But there was a major difference. On the Blue Devils' starting roster, all but one player was an African immigrant, and most were Somali refugees. The 2015 Blue Devils were a dream team. If ever there was a team that encompassed the idea of dream team, this was one. They had outscored their opponents to get to this moment 113-7. So think about that for a minute, right? The Blue Devils scored 113 goals across the season, despite the fact that Coach Mike McGraw usually pulled his starting roster around halftime so that the scores didn't inflate too much. Captain Abdi Sharif Hassan scored 26 goals that season, despite the fact that he almost never made it past halftime, and finished his high school career an All-American with 68 goals total. I'm gonna take a couple seconds just to read about Abdi, who's one of the center points of the book, to think a little bit about what kind of skill we're talking about here. So this is from a chapter called Many Nations, One Team. Already one of the best in the state, the summer before his senior year, Abdi H. somehow managed to get better, doubling down on his already strong work ethic. Not one to cruise on natural talent and athleticism, he worked on his game, his side-to-sides and feints, his free kicks and corners. He bettered his ability to move the ball downfield, using his agility to stop and start, skip and hesitate, beating opponents at every angle. He stayed up late watching soccer online, studying the game, thinking about strategies the team could develop. He watched soccer at Bates, taking notes on team communication. With this intense focus, his already creative approach to the sport became even more innovative. Eric Wagner, who's the head men's coach at Swarthmore and a graduate of Lewiston High School and spends a lot of summertime in Lewiston, Eric Wagner remembers one game that summer in which the rising senior did something that utterly shocked him. A ball was coming in at a very sharp angle to Abdi H's run. Gauging how fast he was flying across the field, and this is Abdi H in action in air. Gauging how a ball was coming at him at a very sharp angle to Abdi H's run. Gauging how fast he was flying across the field, Wagner figured he would take the ball in stride and turn it in the direction he was already heading. Abdi H had other plans. He flicked the ball behind the defender, chasing him. He then made a sharp cut back onto the ball, leaving himself alone to goal. As the ball swished into the net, Wagner sat, stunned, wishing there was an instant replay so he could dissect what he'd just seen. It wasn't only speed. It was seeing an angle, a different facet on the field that no one else saw, and then exploiting it in the blink of an eye. That's the kind of soccer that this record-breaking crowd, and take a really good look at who's sitting in this crowd. This is Maine. This is the kind of soccer that this kind of crowd came to see. And that record-breaking crowd, and there were more people at this soccer game in 2015 than were at the football state championship a couple weeks later. This crowd really exemplified the changes that had taken place in Lewiston over the last decade or so. Now, change was nothing new to Lewiston. It was a city that had continuously evolved since its settlements, from the earliest settlements to its heyday as a thriving textile manufacturing center, to the days when the factories closed and the economy plunged and the young people didn't stick around much anymore. But now this French-Canadian city of some 36,000 people has been on this really interesting path of recovery, becoming host to over 7,000 Somali refugees, people who had been pushed out of their country by civil wars and drought and famine, and into this desperate diaspora. The lucky ones, like Muhammad Khalid's family, finding their way to the refugee camps of Kenya. And I just want to read a couple pieces of Mo's journey. Muhammad Khalid's a defender on the team. Unlike some of his teammates who simply say nice, a word they use often in response to a question they don't want to answer, when asked about growing up in a refugee camp, Mo Khalid speaks freely, vividly, about his time in Hagadera. He remembers the day the grocery store burned down, the robberies, the daily demand to get fresh water before the well shut down during Ayasr, the third of the 5 daily prayers, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He remembers his mother, Habibo Farah, a small, shy woman he describes as the strongest person I know, walking to different houses at night, searching for leftovers his family could have for dinner. He remembers nights with no dinner at all. His father wasn't around much, there was little money, and hunger threatened constantly. When he was just 3 years old, he saw one of his best friends digging through his own excrement to find something, anything, to eat. Looking for a place where they could lay the foundations that would enable their children to get an education, that would enable their children to have a chance, these families found Lewiston in what we call a secondary migration, which means they first landed somewhere else. Most of these families were relocated from Africa to the suburbs of Atlanta, which is one of the largest refugee resettlement arenas in the United States, and then moved to Lewiston, largely because of word of mouth, spreading about the city's space, its affordability, and its schools. Now, this was not necessarily a smooth transition. Within a year or so of those first families arriving, the city's mayor wrote an open letter asking them to tell their relatives and friends to stop coming, that Lewiston was at capacity. They didn't have room for anyone else. A few years later, a man famously threw a frozen pig's head into the downtown mosque during evening prayers. And pork, pig, is not used, not eaten, not touched within Muslim culture. And a national white supremacist group threatened to rally. But in more ways than not, Lewiston is this cautious example of a refugee community successfully integrating and negotiating with its chosen landing space. When you walk through the streets of this still largely French-Canadian town, you have much more of a global experience than you would have 15, 20 years ago. This is a critical facet to how this once downtrodden place has learned to sort of carve a better future and look forward instead of looking backward. And the high school soccer team, in no small way, played a role because soccer, as I write in the introduction of One Goal, is how these kids live where they landed. And this is one of my favorite photos from One Goal. I took this during a summer game, which is why they're wearing their Subway Eat Fresh t-shirts. And you have two huddles going on at the half. You have the team talking to coaches McGraw and Gish. You can see Gish is in the foreground with his back to the camera, figuring out what they're gonna do, strategizing, what have you. But then you see their mothers and sisters in the background, using this time and space of soccer to catch up, sort of create a zone defense for babysitting, and enjoy some time to catch up and enjoy the sun of July. And then in the background, you have the parking lot of the Androscoggin Colisee, which is where hockey takes place, right? So you sort of have this triangle of things that are going on in Lewiston that you just wouldn't have seen not that long ago. And that's really what One Goal is about. It is the story of the Lewiston Blue Devils. It is about the art of soccer that these kids play. And it's how these kids and their families, their coaches and teachers and community leaders create community. It's about why sport matters, and it's about how we make meaning out of sport, where it fits into the threads of our daily lives, and what we can learn from it. At the center of it is this man, Coach Mike McGraw. And it was under his guidance, Lewiston born and bred, that these kids, right, he's in his 4th decade of coaching soccer in Lewiston, that these kids, whether newcomers or longtime Mainers, were going to set a goal for themselves to do something that no one else had done in Lewiston. They wanted to bring home a soccer championship trophy. Everyone who was at the stadium that day, and I come back to this photo because you can read this photo in terms of like something good's going on, right? You can read this photo, you see Assistant Principal Rhonda Fournier trying not to die in the front row as she's holding the kids back. You have kids from the rival high school across you have a Red Eddie in a Lewiston shirt, actually. Like everyone was from Lewiston that day, whether you lived in Auburn or Lewiston. So this day, right, showed so many different journeys that it took to get to this point. And I really focus on the different kinds of journeys that people took to the stadium that day in November. And for those precious game minutes at that state final in November of 2015, most of which saw the Red Storm and the Blue Devils locked into this 0-0 sort of stronghold, these thousands of fans had one thing in common. They all, as Lewiston High School's motto tells us, were bleeding blue. In the book, I describe the moment through this young man. This is Shobo Saban. And he was one of the first Somali players to come onto the varsity soccer roster in Lewiston. And if you read the book, during tryouts, like in the first seconds of tryouts, Shobo throws a rainbow flick. And the coaches were like, okay, you're on the team. So he's one of the very early players. And I talk about this moment through Shobo's eyes as he explained it. These were Lewiston fans, Shobo thought. He flashed back to when his family had first arrived in Lewiston, the days when people told him to leave. His mother told him then to have a big heart, to have empathy. When you love others, she said, sincerely love them, you will eventually get it back. Looking at the crowd of Blue Devils fans, white, black, Muslim, Catholic, Somali, Franco, Shobo realized that his mother was right. While his community wasn't perfect, it was better. He felt the stereotypes, terrorist, drug dealer, pirate, that had plagued him just a few years ago, beginning to disappear. Here, he thought, looking at the field, he was a proud Lewiston soccer player. It was, he would later say, and I love this, he told me that it was a we moment, with soccer creating the space, at least for those few hours, for them to come together as a community, as Blue Devils, bleeding blue, with one goal. But a lot of work goes into having a we moment. And again, I think about those journeys to the field that day in November. Some of those journeys started in Quebec, Canada. Some of them started in Somalia, Africa. And still others started right there in the neighborhoods of Lewiston, Maine. But all of those journeys were trying, as described by Abdi Kadir Negi, who's a community leader in Lewiston. He's a prominent figure in the book, and he is someone who spent 14 years of his life waiting in Dadaab, Kenya, the world's largest refugee camp, to, as he described to me, have welcome, to find a home, and once there, to make it work. So that was the goal, to have welcome. But a lot of things had to happen for that to occur. Mike McGraw had to change the way he coached. He had to understand what it meant to play in the hot summer sun during Ramadan, when most of his players were fasting, not drinking water, not eating food. He had to understand why a player might miss practice, right? You can't miss practice and then play. It's an automatic bench. But he had to figure out how to make it work, because a player had to miss practice to accompany his mother to a doctor's appointment and serve as her translator. And he had to understand that these kids didn't play the kick and chase soccer that had dominated Lewiston play for so long, in the days when soccer was really a way for hockey players to stay in shape during the fall. That these kids played a more sophisticated possession game, a patient game of passing and teamwork. The school had to change the way it taught. It had to accommodate new languages, and it had to accommodate new customs. It had to do things like labeling pork, which again is haram or forbidden in Islam, clearly in the cafeteria. The athletic director had to change the way he managed his sports programs. He had to utilize community volunteers, phone trees, door-to-door, communication in person, to help get permission slips signed and convey the idea that you had to get a team physical and set up connections with community doctors and clinics in order to get those important physicals done. And he hired this man, who's on the left here talking to Malid Abdo, Abdi Jabbar Hirsi. Abdi Jabbar became the school's first Somali coach, hired as an assistant coach for Mike McGraw in 2014. He is the son of Abdullahi Abdi, and Abdullahi Abdi is the soccer person in Lewiston. He is, as Abdi Kadir Negi described to me, the coach of everyone. And this is his son, hired as the first Somali coach with purpose, right? To ensure that best practices were happening on and off the field. Not just to do it in some kind of token representation, but to understand what someone like Abdi Jabbar could bring to the team. For example, Abdi Jabbar can call plays out in Arabic and Somali, which is a little bit of a competitive advantage in the state of Maine against other teams. So capitalizing, right, on this kind of inclusion, teammates had to change the way they looked at one another. They had to think a little bit more decisively about how to make teammates into friends. And their families had to learn how to be neighbors, as Somalis settled into homes right next to multi-generational folks who had been there a long, long time. One of the things that's so important here is just how well the players themselves understood what was at stake. And I love taking a look at the shirt, their team shirt. They have a team shirt every year. This was the team shirt that they decided on before the start of the 2015 season. It was created by co-captains Abdi Sharif Hassan, born in Dadaab refugee camp in Kenya to Somali parents, and Austin Wing, whose French-Canadian heritage exemplifies much of Lewiston's immigration history until recently. If you look in the Lewiston phone book, you've got Wings for days. And this was the shirt that they settled upon. These two captains, one of the greatest goalies in school history, and the other one of the leading scorers in school history, modifying the motto of the U.S. men's national team to capture who they were and what they wanted to do: win their school's first state soccer championship. And it really should make us think for a minute. What does it mean on any field to be one team? It means a lot in Lewiston, Maine. In Lewiston, it means that kids from different countries speaking different languages can come together and win. It means more because in Lewiston, they will tell you, for these guys, soccer is life. In Lewiston, and I think this is one of the most important takeaways, again, the team didn't just tolerate difference. We talk about tolerating things quite often. We talk about tolerance quite often. This goes beyond that. It goes beyond even embracing difference. They capitalized on it. They capitalized how coming from different places in different ways to this field could be an advantage. And I write in the introduction of the book, the meteoric rise of the Lewiston Blue Devils to the top ranks of US high school soccer shows what happens when America works the way it's supposed to, the way it reads on paper. The Blue Devils made this improbable championship run in one of the whitest states in America, in a city that hadn't talked about hope for a very long time. There are 60 million displaced peoples, people that don't have a place to call home in this world. And this story is about a handful of those people who found one. Lewiston's relationship with these players, with their families, it has ebbed and flowed. It is a story that has many painful ruptures, and it also is a story that has many joyful and meaningful coming togethers. It's a story of, and this is the best way I can think to put it, it's a story of a championship hockey town that made room for soccer and understanding what that meant to do that. And it's about the people who accomplished that one thing that for a long time had felt impossible: bringing home a trophy. And this is where the players went the second that final buzzer went off. They went to the stands. You are no longer allowed to do this in the state of Maine because of this moment. The MPA has now passed a rule against doing this. But you can see how high up they are, because look at where their teammates' heads are below them as they climbed into the stand to celebrate with the community, understanding that this was about all of them. I think that one goal, on the one hand, is a really exciting sports story, right? It's a championship story. We love those. But I do hope it's more than that. I hope that it's about how and why we need to take a moment to think about what people can do when they're willing to try to figure out what it means to do it together. Years ago, Coach McGraw asked a few of the Somali newcomers how they would say the words that he says more than any other. He says together all day long, and he always says it twice. He never says anything once. So as they take to the field, it's together, together. As they take possession of the ball, together, together. He asked them how they would say it. And they answered Pamoja Ndugu. Pamoja Ndugu means brothers together in Swahili, and Swahili is one of their common languages from the refugee camps because the refugee camps were in Kenya. These players speak upwards of 5, 6 languages, some of them. Pamoja Ndugu is the phrase that laid the foundation for this team as it prepared for the game of their lives that day in November 2015 as they turned to face the Scarborough Red Storm. I think it's a really good motto. But it's more than that. It's about, again, how to live where you land. I once asked Shobo Saban why he returned to Lewiston after graduating from Assumption College in Worcester. He majored in biology, he had pre-med dreams, and he could have gone anywhere. And he decided to come back to Lewiston to work for the Somali-founded Maine Immigrant and Refugee Services Group. He got married in Lewiston. He's raising his children in Lewiston, one of whom the book is dedicated to. And this is what he said to me. So this is your Somali lesson of the day. Wad maha suntahai. Can you try that? Wad maha suntahai. He told me that returning home from Assumption was his Wad maha suntahai, his thank you. It was better, he reminded me, to thank people through actions, not words. And I write about this in One Goal, and so this is Shobo talking about the importance of public schools in his understanding of deciding to come back. I came here as an immigrant, he says, so the taxpayers who don't even know me, and I never met them, who actually spend money on me to get textbooks, to make sure the teachers get paid, to make sure that I sit in a chair. For all that, I say thank you. I mean, I've never met them. I've never seen them. So that's the reason I say thank you. I say thank you to this community. I live my thank you. I live my Wad maha suntahai. Coming together, of course, doesn't always mean staying together. There's steps forward, there's steps back. But when we think about those 4,500 people trying to touch that trophy, and this trophy goes on quite a journey, when it gets back to Lewiston. The athletic director has some moments of truly not knowing where it is at any one time as different segments of the community took ownership of it. Social media was his best way to sort of track it. But the 4,500 people who are watching that game, who are trying to, get a selfie taken with that trophy, and there's a lot more of those trophies now in Lewiston, those numbers really meant that who was sitting in the stands that day weren't just the parents and friends of players and cheerleaders. It was someone of everyone. It was a coming together for those people in that moment. Now, I cannot emphasize more strongly that a championship soccer season does not fix everything. But it brought that community together for that game, that season. And it let them find their one amidst their many. And it let them find their we in the midst of us versus them. So now they know what it feels like, what it looks like. And in moments when they do pull apart, when they do experience that rupture, they know what to look for in order to get it back. So I'm going to end there and open things up for conversation and discussion, and thank you so much. So questions. There's always got to be the brave first person. What was particular, I'm going to repeat everything because I think they're streaming this. What was particularly difficult about writing the book, different for me? I mean, the first thing that was different for me in writing this book in terms of it being a different style of writing that I had done was truly doubting whether or not I knew how to do this, which was kind of scary, which is why I started reading books about writing. And I think that it's really important to understand that you always have room to admit that you don't know how to do something that everyone assumes you know how to do. Saying I don't know is a really important talent. And if somebody ever makes fun of you for saying I don't know, just say, well, how am I supposed to know unless you tell me, right? I mean, it's don't ever be derided for saying I don't know. So I think that was the first hurdle. And then the most challenging thing once I got there was for quite honestly, for me to loosen up. I came with a very rigid research agenda, that these are the people I'm going to interview, and these are the books I'm going to read, and these are the places I need to go. And I had to not unlearn that, but I had to open myself up to just grab the moment when it happens. My first conversation with Milad Abdo, the king of the flip throw, which Adam mentioned, it happened, I wasn't ready for it. I had seen him in the hallway at school that day. I was sitting in the back of Mike McGraw's biology classroom where I just became this fixture. Students sort of knew that I was there. And he sat down in front of me and I said, hey, Milad, and he said, let's do this. And I was like, right, because I have piles of questions back in my hotel room and I don't have my voice recorder with me, and yes, let's do this. And so learning how to just be ready and to sort of respect the schedule that the folks that I was working with on this were on, and when and where they felt comfortable. I wasn't ready to talk to Milad that day, and we talked for 3 hours. In fact, the lights of the high school went out around us. I'm sure we could have gotten in a lot of trouble. We weren't supposed to still be there, but he was ready to talk and tell his story, so I had to be ready to listen. And I think that that's a takeaway that has stayed with me, that if someone's ready to tell you their story, be ready to listen. The other thing that is attached to that, I mean, Milad, and you can get this from the book, he's an incredibly confident, electric young man, is that very few people think their stories are important. And helping people understand that you do want to know their story. And if you think about it, right, there's that sort of classic, like you get home from school and a parent says, what'd you do today? And you say nothing. And that's not true, right? So it's the same thing with like Mo Khalid. Everybody, how was this? Oh, it was nice. Then you're asking the wrong question. And so being able to figure out how to enable folks to think that their story is important. Somebody would mention something and they'd say, but you don't want to hear about that. Well, yes, I do. Well, why? And that's that kind of relationship of understanding that everyone has a story to tell. It sounds very cliche to say that. But everyone does have a story to tell, and it's up to you to make meaning out of it and to help them make meaning out of it. So I think those were sort of the initial challenges, and then the ones that sort of stayed through. Yeah. It really, the question was, did I find that people were very willing to tell their stories? It really depended, up and down. Mike McGraw, I'm super grateful. There has never been a better book subject in the history of the world, is a storyteller who remembers everything. And that's just a gift as a writer to encounter a human like that. But no, not everyone. And building those relationships, and I understand that. Building trust is really, really important. And how you do it is an uneven path. There were moments where I sort of thought, wow, I'm in the locker room, and I do not remember how that happened. Like, I knew that there was a period of time when I definitely wasn't in the locker room, and now for a variety of reasons that are both uncomfortable and awesome, I am in the locker room. I was in huddles, right? You're like, how am I in the huddle? And when did I have the nerve to get up and walk across and be with the huddle, and when were they okay with it? When was the first time that a family invited me in to break fast with them? My camera became a huge tool. I'm an incredibly visual person. I took about 2,000 photos just to sort of storyboard this. A handful are in the book. But as I talked a little bit last night with some students, these are kids that don't have a lot of photos of themselves. So suddenly one of the ways that I developed, give me your phone number, was, can you text me some photos that you took today of me playing? I started to develop photos, right? Not just digital. They certainly wanted digital for their social, but they also wanted prints of themselves. So my camera became a big tool of that. So it was really what I call the art of hanging around. I was just always there. Mike McGraw called me his bulldog because I was just constantly at his heels. And a comfort level comes with that. But I do think that you have to work really hard to lay foundations of trust. And that when you can build those conversations get a lot easier. But it takes time. It definitely takes time. How long did it take? The first full draft of the manuscript took 12 months, which is nuts. My first book took 6 years. So this was faster. It felt really urgent. If we think back to America, 2015, 2016, 2017, it felt really urgent. So the research and writing was simultaneous, which is not something I usually do. There was a stop the presses moment, because in 2017 they won their second state championship right as the book was going into production, and I had sort of had a hunch about that going into that season. It was not an undefeated season. If you notice in the hardcover, I think most of you have paperbacks, in the hardcover there is very little front pieces because we had to pull some of those pages because there is an epilogue. Because it was the little brothers. There was only one member of the 2015 team who was on the 2017 team. But it is the little brothers who score those goals and who sort of show this path forward. So there was an add-on at the very end, and it was actually a stop the presses moment, which you think doesn't happen in real life, to add, and it was seriously like, you have 672 words to write this epilogue. It was constrained for space, but I'm really glad that we got that in, because I think that the 2017 state championship in a way is even more meaningful, because it shows that this bench is deep and these generations are building, and this isn't a once-off kind of thing. But about a year for that first draft, which is, I still can't imagine that happened. There's got to be a question. Nothing? How long I stayed in Lewiston. I'm still in Lewiston in a lot of ways. I tended to do 4 days up, 3 days home, back and forth, starting almost right away. So it was a little sporadic as I was finishing out a semester, and then that summer, it was the whole summer. And then back up. One of the things that happened that was super lucky for me is that two of the key players in the book, Abdi Sharif Hassan and Muhammad Khalid, did a PG year at the Kent School in Connecticut, which is only about an hour from where I live in New York. So I went up there on weekends, which was great for a bunch of different reasons. They didn't have family coming to watch them on their games on the weekend, where all of the New York area kids did. They didn't have anyone to take them out to dinner afterwards, which all of the rest of the kids did on their team. So that was amazing that I actually had, they sort of came to me. And their families did visit, so that was also really great. Abdi Sharif Hassan ended up at Lowell. He was the first of the players to go D1. He was captain junior and senior year of the Riverhawks. And so that became another location, right, of frequent visits even after the book came out. But it was being pretty deeply embedded for quite a while. The Hampton Inn is pretty much where I wrote this book.
Amy, what are you working on now?
Oh, that question. What am I working on now? I've been really deeply enmeshed in op-ed work, shorter pieces, because the landscape of sport and politics, 2020 has sort of been this turning point in the landscape of sport and politics for a lot of different reasons. And so that work has been plentiful. And I really like it. There's sort of a, having something happen and needing to get a piece out within 2 hours is sort of thrilling, and it's sort of like my Olympic work was for NBC. So it's been a lot of op-ed work. In terms of longer-term projects, I am very deeply enmeshed in sport, the ethics of sport and sport ethics, and sort of what are the questions of sportsmanship that we think about in our daily lives and how sport can inform that. So there's an excellent chance that that's the next book, but I'm not making any promises. We have a couple minutes left. If there are no more questions, I would be happy to read a passage that I didn't read during the talk, because I always want to make sure that you have your opportunity to chat as well. But it's one of my favorite parts of the book, and I think it's something that a lot of student athletes can relate to, and not just student athletes, but students in general, about what you feel like the night before a big test, or a big game, or your college applications are due, or the college decisions are coming in, all of those kind of anxious things. So this is the penultimate chapter of the book, called Everyone Bleeds Blue. And it starts the morning of the big game. None of them could sleep. All throughout Lewiston, Blue Devils tossed and turned. Up at 5, the pressure of his first state final plagued Masla. Usually so self-assured, today he was nervous. He kept thinking about sitting in the bleachers after the Chevrolet game, absolutely devastated, tears rolling down his face. Chevrolet was the 7th seed coming into that game, he kept thinking, and Lewiston lost. Now they were facing the best. Already showered, Masla decided that worrying wasn't getting him anywhere. He ate something, brushed his teeth, and headed back to bed, hoping sleep would come. Q felt the same way. He'd finally shut his eyes well after midnight, around 2 or so. When he woke up, he looked at the clock, 6 a.m. That surprised him. He usually wasn't an early riser, especially on a Saturday, but this was no ordinary Saturday. Like Masla, he'd never played in a state final. Last year in Syracuse, he'd waited to hear from his friends about the championship game. When the text finally came, the news wasn't good. Now he was back in Lewiston with his teammates, and it was exciting, something he'd imagined since the moment told him they were moving. Giving up on getting any more rest, Q got out of bed and pulled himself together. The oldest of 8, he wanted to get out of the apartment before anyone else woke up. Food, he thought. Donuts. He didn't eat donuts very often. They weren't cheap, but he wanted something different, something with frosting. Somali donuts, kak, didn't have frosting. They were more like a biscuit, eaten with tea. An American donut was a treat, Q thought. A breakfast of champions, maybe, to celebrate the day. Leaving the apartment quietly, he walked over to the Italian bakery. The white cement block building sits on Bartlett Street next to Mark W. Paradis Park, where Malid used to kick a ball around with his dad and Abdi Kadir Negi held soccer practice in the early days of the SBYA League. The bakery is one bit of color on the drab rundown street, its red and green stripes and bright awning resembling the Italian flag. E molto buono, the sign says. It's very good. The bakery opens at 6 every morning but Monday. Its hand-cut donuts often selling out on the weekend. "It's early," Q noted again, as light crept across the city on his short walk to the bakery. Really early. On the other side of the city, Austin, too, was awake and wanting a donut. He didn't go to the Italian bakery. That was more of a downtown thing. Instead, he drove over to Dunkin' Donuts, which he often did before school. The game was at noon, but Coach wanted them at the high school by 10. Everything felt off. They never played this early. Deck didn't want donuts. He wanted sleep. He had been up most of the night thinking about the preseason loss to Scarborough. Now he was panicking that he wouldn't play well with so little sleep. He thought about last year's state final, which he, like Masla, watched from the stands. It was terrifying to think about. Chevrolet was supposed to be easy, he thought, and Lewiston lost. What if it goes hard on us again? We need to get a wrench on these guys, he decided. We can't do anything stupid. He looked at the clock. Still 2 hours until he had to leave. It was going to be a frustrating morning. Like the others, Malid had been awake for hours, up so early he took a 30-minute nap at 8, unable to keep his eyes open. He woke up again when Q called. He wanted to come over to show Malid his new haircut, which he was hiding from his mother. He got it cut after the ritual spaghetti dinner at Trinity the night before. A mohawk, like Nuri's. They wanted to do something cool. Beast mode, Q said, like the team had done last year when they sprayed their heads blue and white. You look good, you play good, Coach Gish always told them. Let Scarborough waste their time on hair, Malid thought, his own shaped into a box style. But still, Q got a mohawk? Come over, Malid told him. My mom wants to see your hair, and then we'll get ready here. While the players were waking up, Gish's daughter, Lily, was busy at the school decorating the team bus. I've got to do something, she told him after they won the regional title. But Coach Gish didn't really pay attention to her plans until his wife, Cindy, asked him about it. You guys decorating the bus? She said. No, Gish answered, just want to keep things normal. Yeah, she responded, that's not an option. Cindy Gish knew Lewiston. Her father worked as city clerk for decades, and she and her 4 sisters all graduated from the high school. Now principal of Geiger Elementary, she'd worked her way through the ranks of the school system, teaching first at McMahon before serving as assistant principal there and at Montello. But back in the day, she was a state championship-winning cheerleader, and she knew that her daughter's idea was a good one. You really need to decorate that bus, she repeated. Gish stood firm. We're going to keep it as normal as possible. Come on, we're gonna go decorate the bus, she replied. They need that bus decorated. Cindy and Lily weren't talking about a few posters. They got blue and white streamers and made signs for each player to put in the windows. For the back of the bus, Lily made a bigger sign. We love McGraw. That's awesome, Gish said when he saw it, just wicked. When the players started arriving at the high school just before 10, Gish thought back to the classic husband and wife conversation. My wife, he thought, looking at the players' faces when they saw the bus, is obviously the most intelligent person in this family. Q didn't see the bus when he arrived at the back of the school near the gym entrance. No one was there. He panicked. Did he miss it? Hey, Abdi-Jabbar called out, walking over to him from his car. You're in the wrong place. Hersey and Q walked around to the front of the school. Beautiful, Q thought when he saw the bus. He'd never seen anything like it. The first time he was going to States and he'd be riding a bus decorated like that, unbelievable. No one had ever done anything like this for him. No one had ever done anything like this for any of them. Who did this so early in the morning, Malid asked when he walked up. He shook McGraw's hand before stepping on the bus, taking in the posters, the drawings of trophies, the streamers cascading from the ceiling all the way down the aisle. We are devils, read a big sign in the middle. LHS, read another. Malid started to feel some of his nerves dissipate. It felt good looking at this bus, but Deck couldn't shake his nerves. He loved the decorations, the support they represented, but all of it made him more anxious. I don't want to disappoint these people, he thought, looking at the decorations. And his dad was going to the game. He didn't want to disappoint his dad. They took their seats next to their bedazzled names, Q and Nuri's haircuts giving everyone something to talk about. Joe, too, had shaved the sides of his head. Q settled into his seat, finally smiling. Mossel, he noticed, wasn't talking to anyone, earbuds already in place. Good idea, Q thought. He put on his headphones. McGraw gave the team a few encouraging words as the bus pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward the turnpike. Abdi H. wondered if anyone was even listening. Because of the decorations, they couldn't see out the windows, which gave the bus an almost cave-like atmosphere. listen up, McGraw rasped. He didn't have much to say. The offense was unstoppable, the back line a wall. Usually he talked to them about the what-ifs of the game, about who might lure them into an offside trap or put a shell on them. Both Mount Blue and Mount Ararat had done that, forcing them to make adjustments in the second half. McGraw had a hunch Scarborough would try the same to shut down Abdi H. and Masla. But he didn't need to tell them that. They were a mature group of guys. Mental preparation was the biggest challenge, and he'd been talking about that since the beginning of the season. This is going to be my way and their way, he thought. I'm not going to tell them how to do this. So he simply told them to play their game, no matter what Scarborough threw at them. McGraw took a moment to feel the enormity of what he was about to say to them. It was more than soccer, and it had been for quite a while. His players just wanted to play, just wanted to win, and McGraw wanted that too. Wanted it for so long it was hard to remember a time when he didn't want it. But he also knew where he was from and what it meant to be the coach of this team in this town with this one goal. He looked at them hard, his blue eyes serious. Say it simple, he thought. We're going to do it together. Thank you so much.